Okay, the recent summer, the recent climate devastation that has struck the country has shown us that we are now living in a climate emergency. At least 33 people have died in bushfires in Australia since the summer season began in October, and some of those fires have been burning before that. Affecting more than 10 million hectares across the country, with a shocking 1 billion animals estimated to have perished in the fires. Our next presenter has been one of the lead voices who has been warning governments of the severity of climate impacts and the associated risks and threats for many years. He is a former Commissioner of Fire and Rescue New South Wales and an internationally recognised expert in responding to major bushfires and natural disasters.
Look, this is deadly serious. Hotter, drier, windier, far more dangerous. So I've been fighting fires since 1971. I grew up in Terry Hills, northern suburbs of Sydney. My father was a volunteer firefighter from the mid-1950s when he moved there. He told me stories about fighting fires as a teenager in 1939, January 1939. Told me stories about lightning coming out of the smoke, which people said, that's impossible. Now we know, oh, that's pyroconvective activity. Who can spell pyrocumulonimbus? Or public school students. So what did we see coming? And when I say we, I was told I'm only allowed to have 4 slides, but now we are emergency leaders for climate action. Now it's growing by the day. I had an indignant phone call last night from a former fire chief in Northern Territory, an old friend, saying, why didn't you invite me? Back in March last year, I started talking to former colleagues from every state and territory about climate change, and what was fascinating was they come from a spectrum of political beliefs, and each and every one of them said, yes, during our careers we've seen things change, we've read the science, what we're seeing is actually worse than the scientific evidence and predictions. So we need to call on the government to do something. The 2019 fire season was always going to be a shocker. We dodged a bullet in 2018. The monsoon came in, New South Wales became humid and wet in about October, November, and that enabled them to supply hundreds of firefighters to Tasmania, to Victoria, to Queensland. Without that, 2018 would have been a really bad year. 2019 would have been the absolute disaster that it was. So it was almost inevitable. Now, so what have we got? Over the last 20 years, reduced rainfall. So 15 to 20% reduction in winter rainfall. So big deal. What's that mean? It means we can't do hazard reduction like we used to. So I remember as a kid going away in the school holidays in May, and it always rained and we were always camping and it was always miserable, but we did it every year anyway. Go figure. We don't get those winter rains now. So when the westerly winds come in New South Wales in July, August, and it's on average 1 degree warmer. Now, averages are interesting because the extremes are on top of that average. And the averages aren't just during the day, they're at night. And we get incredible drying of bushfire fuels because of that 1 degree kick in temperature. So once we hit August, we're getting major fires that we can't control. We're losing homes in August. That never happened. Decades ago, it just never happened. This decade, it's been happening regularly. So the New South Wales bushfire danger period runs from October to March. It's in legislation. It's 110 years of observations, weather observations. Not anymore. Runs from the first week of August, often through to May. 2018, you might remember we had huge fires in southwest Sydney in April, running from Molesworth through to Sutherland, thousands of homes threatened. A couple of weeks before Tathra, we had 69 homes destroyed at Tathra on the far south coast at a time when their season should have been over. The worst fire danger index ever recorded there in that month. And we were losing houses at Bega in April that year. August that year, Ulladulla, Port Stephens. So 2019 came along, we were fighting fires in July up in Tenterfield. Now, my background, in a nutshell, was a volunteer firefighter with my dad. 1978, I became a full-time firefighter, 39-year career, 13 years as commissioner at the end. I'm now back fighting fires on the front line as a volunteer, and I've been all over the state. I'm seeing things that I never imagined. Now, again, let's see what other... increased fire danger, days of very high fire danger and above. We used to have about 10 years, 13 years between bad fire seasons in New South Wales. It's just about every year now. Now, the canary in the coal mine, I think, is Tasmania. They had major bushfires in 1898, 1933, 1967 when Hobart was almost wiped out. I think 62 people lost their lives, 1,700 buildings burnt. 1998, and then what happened? 2006, 2013, 2016, 2018. Are you getting the picture? The Blue Mountains, 1926, I think it was 1939, then I think 1946, I'm not sure of that one. 1957, 68, 77, I was there fighting those fires. 1994, and then 01, 07, 2013, 2019. So you can see the frequency of fires becoming, getting closer and closer together. Victoria, so big fires, 1939, 1983, Ash Wednesday, and so going back to the 1800s, they're about 50 years apart, and then 26 years later, 2009, we had Black Saturday. So the frequency is really concerning, and that's a symptom. Now, what our paradigm of firefighting operations in Australia, we shared resources. So the fire seasons would move from the north to the south. Queensland, which wasn't a bushfire state, but is now a bushfire state, they've had the biggest losses of homes in history this last season. They'd have their season, then New South Wales would share resources, Victoria would send them up, then Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia. It was sequential. Now they overlap. And that's why in New South Wales we had firefighters from the US, Canada, New Zealand, but we can't get the aircraft from California because they overlap with us. Places that have never burned are burning. Greenland, the Arctic Circle, the UK. I've been advising fire chiefs in the UK for years about how to handle bushfires. This is just getting worse and worse. Now, I talked about my dad telling me about lightning, fires causing their own thunderstorms, pyroconvective activity. It was a bit like the legend of the Yeti. No one had really seen it, but apparently it happened. I've seen half a dozen this year. I'd seen 2 in my entire career before this. And the numbers, Jason Sharple's a scientist, about 62, going back to the 70s, I think, 30 this season. So, where are we going? I don't know. The fire services cannot cope. We showed that. It took rain to put it out. The current fire chiefs were saying that it's going to take a huge rain event. We got the huge rain event in Sydney. So I went from coordinating fire trucks at fires to coordinating fire trucks at floods, trees down and flood rescues with the SES last weekend. So we get these wild swings. I hate this thing, the new normal. We've got to get new language because normal, people go, oh yeah, it's normal. No, it's normal. It's not right. We can't handle it. I offered to meet the Prime Minister and he said bugger off. Now, we tried to warn him back in April, May, again in October. We finally met with Minister Littleproud and he couldn't wait to get out of the meeting to disparage us in a press conference. We were still in Parliament House. That's the government we've got. They're in denial. We can't be. This is a disaster. This is an emergency. Thanks. Oh.
Thank you, Greg. They're in denial, we can't be. This is an emergency. I just think I'll repeat everyone's last lines all day. It'll be good. Okay, now we're going to have a panel talking about what is everybody's problem, climate change. We're going to talk about frontline climate stories across Australia. Australia's first responders and affected communities are confronting the devastating climate impacts playing out around the country. In this, our first session, we'll hear how bushfires and drought, national security risks and health are hitting us from all angles. We've already heard quite a lot about that from Greg, with increasing severity and regularity. And I'd like to welcome the rest of our panel, because Greg, as you can see, has already taken his seat for this session. Firstly, Michael Thomas. Dr. Michael Thomas is Senior Fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Centre for Climate and Security, where he leads the Climate Change for Security Professionals and Military Practitioners course. He is a graduate of the Australian Defence Force Academy and served for 20 years as an officer in the Australian Army, including stints in signals intelligence, capability management and military instruction. We also have Anika Molesworth. Anika is a farmer from Broken Hill and Director of Farmers for Climate Action, a movement of 5,000 farmers across Australia taking action behind and beyond the farm gate. She was awarded the 2015 Young Farmer of the Year, 2017 New South Wales finalist for Young Australian of the Year, and the Green Globe Award for Young Sustainability Champion. We also have Paddy Manning, who is the contributing editor politics for The Monthly, and he has more than a decade of experience as a journalist for the ABC, Crikey, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, the Australian Financial Review and The Australian. He is the author of several books and is currently working on a new one titled Body Count: How Climate Change is Killing Us. Well, catchy title. Would you please once again welcome all the members of the panel. How this is going to work is that each of our panellists, apart from Greg, who we've just heard from, will give us a short presentation, say a few words, and then we'll get into a discussion, and then we will open the floor to you. I hope you have got the details of where to ask the questions, which didn't come up on the screen behind me before, because that's the way we're going to do it. So they'll come up on the screen here, and I'll read them to our panellists. Just because of time, and also it's really hard to see you. You're very in the dark. Only, of course, literally, not metaphorically. Okay, let us begin. And as Paddy Manning is sitting next to me, he can go first.
Okay, thanks, Jane. G'day, everyone. Forgive me if I talk a bit fast because I will make sure I hit my 5 minutes. So, the slide could you just show that first one? That's the book. So that's the cover, likely. Body Count: How Climate Change is Killing Us. So that'll be out in May. And for the past 8 months, I've travelled from Launceston to Townsville, Kinglake to Grantham, talking to the victims of some of Australia's worst natural disasters. These are people who've lost mothers and fathers, partners, sons, daughters, and have amazing stories to tell of fear and courage, trauma and recovery. Some of these tragedies are famous, like Black Saturday or the Queensland floods of 2011, and some are less well known, like heat waves or the thunderstorm asthma outbreak of 2016. When disaster happens, it's often seen as insensitive, opportunistic or politicising to start talking about climate change. It's a tactic straight out of the playbook of the NRA that so effectively prevented gun law reform in the United States. Body Count will have that conversation. Just like the weather, it's not possible to definitively, of course, attribute a particular death to global warming, but it is possible to say that climate change was a factor. And it's certain that the stories told here are early warning signs of worse to come. So the first slide is that guy. Okay, David Tenner. He lost his wife Alison in the Canberra bushfires of 2003. He worked at the Air Force Base in Richmond. Alison was staying at home with their 3 teenage sons in Duffy on the outer edge of the city right next to large pine plantations. Dry lightning started the fires in January 2003 and went on to burn more than 1 million hectares in the ACT, New South Wales and Victoria. Scientists say it was the first time that had happened. The fires had so much energy they generated a tornado. When they roared into Canberra's suburbs, the official advice was to return to your homes. 500 houses burned down, and it's a miracle no more than 4 lives were lost. Alison, David's wife, died in her bath, and he's standing there at the memorial in Canberra. You can see a brick with Alison's name there. He agrees that his wife was a victim of climate change, wants her to be remembered, and he wants action. Leon Chalmer Hearn died at Stills Creek on Black Saturday in a well-prepared home that had a brilliant fire plan according to the Royal Commissioner. I spoke to their son Dale on the right here, who works for the state government. He said, according to a neighbour, the last person to see his mum alive, the fire front came through in 90 seconds. It tore the roof off the Ahern's property. Once that happens, Dale says, it's game over. He told me, quote, I've read other accounts of properties in the district where the house didn't burn down, the house was lifted up and torn apart. This was a key difference between Ash Wednesday and Black Saturday, he says. Quote, and his dad and his uncle defended that very property in Ash Wednesday. In 1983, when lives were lost where they were leaving, in 2009 they were defending. Stay or go was thought to be the best plan. That was a plan that was designed for a different level of threat than what was there on that day. The climate had changed. And that little kookaburra was taken by Jenny Barnett, who died, their neighbour who died. She might even be known to some people in this room. Funny how one button can fail to work. There. Chuck McLeod, an 80-year-old diabetic with heart problems who lived in a little housing estate near Seven Hills in Western Sydney. On a 40-degree day just after Christmas in 2018, after a beer and a half, Chuck decided bugger the doctors and took off up to Bunnings on his mobility scooter. On the 20-minute round trip, he would have sucked in so much ground-level ozone, soon after returning home he collapsed. His doctor of 14 years, Kim Liu, who campaigns for Doctors for the Environment, told a Stop Adani rally last year how for the very first time she wrote on the death certificate, heart attack/heat. Chuck's Conservative daughter Evelyn, who's pictured here with a photo of her dad, she doesn't know whether Chuck's death was caused by climate change, and he was old and he had lots of comorbidities, but she told me she just wants to get the word out, look after your old folks in the heat. There's only 2 more. Danny McBride, a former bikie and tow truck driver who lost his wife Link, Cheyenne and 2 of their 3 kids in the Grantham floods of 2011. This story of those floods is well known. Rescue workers described the Grantham flood as an inland tsunami, washed whole houses away. Danny was an RFS brigade captain who ignored instructions from headquarters down in Southport and worked all night rescuing people from the rising floodwaters. When the wave hit his home, Danny and Link tried to escape with the kids in the fire truck. Only Danny survived, along with Zach, his middle-aged son, who he threw out the window and said, climb up that tree. Danny doesn't read. He blames the collapsed wall at the local quarry for the flood, and he doesn't trust the CSIRO or the Bureau of Meteorology. Quote, you look at the Weather Bureau, they tell you to look out for storms and that. You never get them because they're only guessing. He thinks the climate's changing back to the way it was when he was a kid. Mark and Gerard Orford, whose mother Mary died in the 2016 floods at Latrobe near Launceston. It was caused by an east coast low storm that shocked emergency chiefs with the front stretching from Queensland to Tasmania. Mary was old and couldn't get up the tight spiral staircase of the A-frame house that was built beside the Mersey River, which split in two when a wall of water came crashing down the valley, flooding their parents who were trapped. A council bulldozer, a police swift water rescue team couldn't get to the house, and as the night wore on, their father tried to float Mary on a mattress. So the water's coming up, he's got her on a mattress, he hung onto her, so the water's freezing, it's pitch black, he hung onto her so long that the muscle ripped from his bone. Okay, and then at some point, he goes upstairs and gets trapped, can't come back down, she dies in that bedroom, lounge room. And Mark and Gerard think, okay, what caused that the rain wasn't that heavy. They're not sure whether it's the hydro released some water or what, but they're not climate skeptics. And the quote here, you hear too much about it to be skeptical and say, well, it's not there. It's obviously happening. What impact does it have on events like that? I don't know. Over a period of time, could it have done? Absolutely. No argument from me there. Something other than a lot of rain caused that, or something else contributed to it. I don't know what caused it. To me, it was rain plus plus. So I've got more stories, about a dozen people, man who lost his wife to melioidosis after the Townsville floods, or, a woman I'm going to interview in Mernda tonight who lost her partner to thunderstorm asthma. So these stories are a glimpse of Australia's hotter future, equally terrifying and inspiring as people respond by helping each other, showing love and guts. Driving into country towns from rural Tassie to far north Queensland, asking for interviews, talking to victims, I've expected to strike hostility. And I've had plenty of climate skeptics, and I've had plenty of people who declined to participate. But I've also been genuinely surprised at the willingness of people to share these stories with me and allow me the privilege of telling them. It's not what I expected, a range of views, but in some ways it should not be surprising. This group of Australians, like every other, is split about the impact of global warming. Even among the people who've suffered the most from climate change, there's uncertainty and confusion. The true risks of climate change have not been properly spelt out to the Australian people, and so we've failed to manage those risks and failed to act to reduce emissions. In one way, it's ignorance that's killing us, not climate change. Thank you. So body count aims to cut through all the figures, the degrees and the parts per million and the percentages, and tell the Australian stories that show the dangers of the hotter world we are creating. Thank you.
Thank you, Paddy. Michael.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Michael Thomas, and I'd just like to thank Paddy for that sobering description. And we often talk about the big things of climate change and the differences, but sometimes it's really important to just see the way it's impacting real people out there. And I spent 20 years in the military, and the military is big on its traditions and customs and these sorts of things. And there's a saying that the military has, lest we forget. And I just wonder, as you're scrolling through the roll call there, if in generations' time we'll be thinking about that in a similar way. I've got 5 minutes today to have a quick chat, and here's my slides. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly and really, I suppose, just try and condense for you 10 years of research that I've done into the security impacts of climate change. I think it's fair to say that climate change has arrived as Australia's #1 security issue. I don't think we can hedge our bets and put it off for a future generation anymore. It's here and it's now, and this summer we saw that. It's clear. But it's had a mixed history, climate change as a security issue. In this country, we tend to focus on what you might call the hard security issues of terrorism, of border security, of high-end warfighting and so on. But elsewhere around the world, when we look, particularly across Europe, across the US, across the United States, they're onto this. They've been onto it for a long time. In fact, during my research, I saw that the United States in the late 1970s even identified climate change as a national security risk. This discussion has been powerful and it's been big, but it hasn't had the same level of perhaps cachet or perhaps interest for the Australian defence sector and security sector across, well, indeed, since it's been a real issue for some decades now. One of the challenges, probably the biggest challenge for a defence, from a defence perspective and a security perspective, more so from the Australian Defence Organisation, is the partisan political divide and the challenges that presents. The ADF, the military, is an apolitical organisation, and so it is super tuned into what's going on the political side. And so it makes it very difficult when we have such a partisan, toxic climate politics in this country for the military to really get actively engaged in thinking about what those security threats are and being engaged in national debates on climate change and climate security. And that's a great shame, to be honest. It's a great miss because for me and for large sections of the community, when generals or admirals speak, people listen. So it's been a voice that's been missing to some degree from our national narrative on climate change. And I put this quote up there, some of you may be familiar with it, from Fawlty Towers, this idea of don't mention the war. I mentioned it once and I think I got away with it. This is how sort of climate change is sort of almost dealt with inside the military. I also read a comment from a Pentagon colleague who said that the Pentagon under Trump now talk about climate change like 8th graders talk about sex in code words. So it's this sort of creates this really difficult dynamic or difficult ability for the military to get out there and actually have a say and have a voice. So, conscious of time, I will move along. I just want to make the point on that one though, that when Morrison talks about his practical doctrine and he's flagging some changes, this sort of idea that he's going to get the military out there and this precedent speed set and he's going to do this, that and the other, you can't do anything unless you're reducing emissions. That's the source of the threat. So, it would kind of be like you're fighting ISIS in Syria. On the one hand, you've got your frontline troops, but at the back end, you're actually resupplying them on the other. It's nonsensical. So you've got to have both. This is just different ways to conceive of security. In this country, we're focused about national security, but we shouldn't forget there's other lenses, if you will, of how to view security. Ecological security, human security, and of course global security. Climate change has implications and ramifications across this entire pyramid. And I should say this is just the way I conceive of it. The point here though is that climate change, if you undermine that base, and that's what climate change does, it undermines ecological security, then everything else upwards on that pyramid crumbles. So it's, we shouldn't just focus on the national security, there are other elements and dimensions to it. Just a couple of points on the ADF itself. The fires have brought home to the ADF that it's almost, the ADF, certainly from some of the colleagues I speak to, is now awake to the idea that climate change is a security threat. So it is permeating deeper and wider within defence itself. I've seen now a lot of analysts, a lot of talk since the fires are coming out and saying, well, gee, we missed this one, but how about we need to do this or we need to do that? So the conversation is now starting to be had. Make the point as well, the ADF is the largest landholder in Australia. It has around 72 major bases across the country. It's got a budget of $36 billion with a projected forecast of $200 billion across the next decade. So this is big money. And so what climate change is going to start to do is to make that conversation, start people thinking about, gee, if we're spending, say, $70 billion on 12 submarines, $17 billion on 50-odd joint strike fighters, what if we actually threw a little bit more money to aerial firefighting capability, or more engineering services, or more hospitals? So this is an important conversation that needs to be had in the country, and if we're going to get serious about it, if Morrison's going to get serious about it, that's the direction it needs to go. I'm conscious of my time here. So there's just some snapshots. I just want to call out two slides there. That's what really surprised me about the recent fires was the breadth and scope of what the ADF did during the bushfires. And it's actually, it was a heck of a lot, and it's really encouraging to see, but it's not the solution. But some things that defence can offer, I'll just call out two things there. One is leadership. General Jake Elwood there, who headed up the operation from a military perspective, great guy, great leadership, people do listen. I just love that point about the sort of the hardened vets there with the, nursing the koalas and the native wildlife. Who would have thought you'd have veterans of Afghanistan sitting there providing milk for our native wildlife. So it's this idea of that it permeates in ways that we could never conceive, and so we need to get a good minds thinking about what that's going to entail. Carbon blueprint. The military also has a carbon footprint. This is the ADF's carbon footprint, 1.7 million tonnes. It's small change when you compare it on a national scale, but actually against some countries, it's actually a bit. I've actually also worked out that, or done some calculations, that if the global military sector was taken as a country, then it would be within the top 20 emitters globally. So it's just something to consider for the military. I'm not going to touch on that. I'm just going to touch on this as the last slide. NASA in the last day, some of you may have seen this, have updated this, the image, if you like, the rendering image of the pale blue dot. And this was the Viking that set off from Florida in 1977, and in 1990, Carl Sagan said, you know what, let's turn the camera around and let's take a photograph of the Earth from 6 billion kilometres away. And this is the image. This is called pale blue dot for those that are unfamiliar. But if you look closely, you'll see that that arrow there points to Earth. Everything that's ever happened on that planet. And if you look really closely, you won't see another one. So I'm just going to leave that as my closing slide. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Anika.
G'day everyone. How lovely is this gentle rain? I'm from way out west where the rain don't fall, so I'm enjoying it. So this is a photo of my beautiful parents on my family farm out in far western New South Wales near Broken Hill, which is a stunningly beautiful part of the country with rich biodiversity and this beautiful farming community. This is where I grew up with my brothers. This is where I'll be getting married next month. This is where family members have been laid to rest. So this is a place that I have a very strong sense of belonging to, a sense of responsibility, of looking after this place and the people who live here. So it's breaking my heart that this is what my family farm has become. The future that I thought I had is being blown away. And the rate and the scale of the changes that are happening out there are something we can't adapt quick enough to. We've done extensive tree plantings, but when open ground soil temperatures are reaching 70 degrees Celsius, it's no wonder those trees are baking. We have African sheep and goats, which are arguably the most hardiest livestock species on the planet, but it's too hot and dry for them anymore, so we've had to sell them because they're no longer dropping lambs, because extreme high temperatures actually make sheep and goats infertile. Season after season, records are being smashed in high temperatures and low rainfalls. And anyone in this room under the age of 40, we have never known a year of global average temperatures or below. So why does this matter to you guys in the audience? Because I'm a food producer who grows the food that ends up on your plate. And my family farm no longer produces food. But I'm not here to seek sympathy. I'm here because I'm frustrated, because it doesn't have to be this way. And agriculture holds a very unique position on the topic of climate change because, yes, we are a part of the problem. We contribute greenhouse gas emissions. We are one of the most vulnerable and exposed industries to the impacts of climate change, and we are a key player in the solutions. And there are so many solutions, ways that we can reduce emissions from our sector, ways that we can capture and store carbon that has been put up in our atmosphere in excess. We know what the accelerators are: policy, capital, behaviour, social change. And we know what benefits will come of this. Benefits to society, benefits to jobs in the economy, benefits to our environment to make it more productive, to make it more resilient to these changing conditions. And if you're interested to learn more about the solutions that agriculture holds, head along to Farmers for Climate Action. Write it down in your book. This is a national movement of farmers who are finding the courage to admit that, yeah, we play a very important role on the topic of climate change. We're feeling the impacts today. We're seeing it when we look out the kitchen window. And we want to be part of the solutions. And I think everyone here can actually play a role in this larger story. Time, treasure, and talent. Donate your time to these causes, donate your treasure to these causes. You have these skills, you have these circles of influence, so we can all step out and to be the leaders that we have been waiting for. Thank you.
Thank you, Anika. Thank you, everyone, for everything in this session, including Greg's wonderful speech and all your presentations. I've scribbled down a few questions while you were talking. And the first one is sort of to you, Paddy, but open to everyone. Just jump in if you want to add something. Pardon me. The human stories are incredibly powerful. I mean, they, more than anything, I think, have the ability to move people towards action. And I just suddenly thought, while you were talking about your book, Body Count, that the organisation Destroying the Joint started keeping a record of all the women who are murdered due to domestic violence. And that's been a very powerful tool in terms of creating greater awareness of domestic violence and its cost to us as a society. Why not? And I can't think of a better name for something about people being killed basically by climate change than another Destroying the Joint. After all, that's basically what's going on. I mean, why don't we make these stories more? I mean, I know you're doing everything you can, but we have been very much a stats, dry facts kind of a movement. Do you think the time has come to move into a more shocking, quite, dramatic, like Destroying the Joint kind of way of going?
Well, it's a complicated question because, first of all, like the biggest killer from climate, if it's heat or smoke or whatever, they're silent killers, they're statistical deaths. And often with heat, like the cause of death is not properly written down. It's a heart attack or it's some other reason. So actually putting your finger on the deaths is not easy, scientifically or medically. But I think, someone was saying to me, the way the state ascribes the cause of death is actually one of the fundamental acts of, the state. It's a powerful thing. And I think it's about, just sort of shifting the lens a little bit and going, well, actually that is, that death toll is related to climate. And I'm just trying to sort of start that discussion with the book. But I think you do need to, the problem is it's like Rebecca Huntley saying that, is the alarm just an emergency, just turns the people that need to be persuaded about climate change, it turns them off. So I'm kind of stuck on that dilemma.
What do the rest of you think? Greg?
Look, one of the hats I wear is chair of the ambulance board in New South Wales, and one of the biggest killers is heat waves. So it kills far more people than bushfires, floods, and Sydney and Melbourne and Canberra were smoked in, so the number of, I don't know how many people died, early deaths from respiratory complaints. So these are all climate driven. So you add them all up, extreme weather, floods, cyclones, very severe cyclones, the body count just goes up, and I think we should all be very, very concerned, and governments should be.
So maybe that's something the AMA could think about if they suspect as a doctor that a death is related, as you quoted the doctor saying, heart attack, heat. Maybe they could say heart attack, climate change.
I'd just say the AMA's, even the four, people we've heard from this morning that as doctors, the AMA's, it's got to be careful. They've got to be careful. They have got a conservative membership. There are arguments within the membership about it. They can't. There's only so much. Like Tony Bartoni, for example, did not want to be interviewed for this book, notwithstanding putting his name to a climate emergency declaration. It's very political.
Could I also just make the point that it's not just the human lives that we're losing here. The loss of biodiversity that we're seeing in this country is just inexcusable. In the arid region, we've got this incredible, rich and wondrous biodiversity that have evolved over millennia to survive the harshest of conditions, and we are seeing them disappear from our landscape. On my own family farm, we have these ancient old river red gum trees, 500-year-old trees, and they're dying now. And these are markers on our landscape saying we have not experienced conditions like these for hundreds of years when we see trees like those dying.
Michael, you want to say?
Yeah, Jane, I was just going to make the point from a security perspective, a military perspective, on that idea of attribution, attributing, this event caused that. I think that's been a challenge from a security perspective, because traditionally, sort of that hard security, it's like, there's the bad person or the bad country, right? We've got a clearly defined enemy, clear as day, and we shape our whole sort of military-industrial complex around, that particular adversary. Whereas climate change is much more different from that. It really gets into the fabric of all our economic, transport, health, everything, environmental, ecological. And so from a security perspective, it's much more difficult. It's ubiquitous, it's ephemeral, it's everywhere, and it's all of us. So very challenging security issue, but just that point about attribution.
Thank you all for that. And to the point that came up a little bit, particularly from you, Paddy, why, this still puzzles me, why are the politics around this issue of climate change, which we can all see is happening, I mean, the evidence is overwhelming, why so toxic in Australia, not toxic in Europe, not toxic in Britain, even under Boris Johnson, of whom I am no fan? But, why is the barrier the very system that we thought we could trust to look after the very basic things like enough food and, better health for the population? Why is that our barrier?
Well, that's what I think about ignorance is, and it's not a criticism of people, it's just that, when AIDS came, we had a massive campaign to warn
Led
Australians.
the world in that.
Yeah. When Australia has led the way on tobacco control, plain packaging, the government just has been absent on climate. It has not warned. So you go up to Kinglake and they are still, the people I interviewed in Kinglake, still a sore point about climate. And yet you bloody well hear Bernard Teague on the radio the other day going, we didn't talk about climate change in the Royal Commission because all the scientists were agreed on it, so it seemed like a side issue. Like, what? So that was a moment, that was the worst climate disaster we've had, hundreds and hundreds of people dead, and the government said nothing about it. A royal omission, half the people. So basically, a decade later, they're still divided up in Kinglake about, no, it wasn't really climate, it was, nature cleaning up. Like, what? So I think the government has got a major public education job that it should have done that it hasn't done.
Well, Greg, you came up against the toxic politics when you tried to meet with our Prime Minister before the fire season. What's your take on it?
Look, I don't really understand it. I think the Prime Minister might regret a few things, holding up bits of coal, not meeting with fire chiefs, etc., but I can't find it in me to feel sorry for him. I apologise for that. It's a big job. He's there to protect us. I was told by former public servants who worked in Canberra that the moment we put in our letter the words climate change, we were discarded as activists and political, and that we could not be trusted, just like those doctors, those radical doctors and those radical scientists who actually point to evidence and data and research, can't be trusted. So sorry, everyone. I'm an activist.
Good. Michael?
Just going to make the observation, I think that it's important that we reach, I think one of the things I've realised from the security perspective is we're having conversations with people that are not here today, are not sort of across the science and, reaching into that section to the community. So from a security perspective, I think about those from a conservative, a right, from the right of politics, who may not necessarily listen to, Adam Bann or Peter Garrett, but may listen to, a general or a retired admiral that stands up and says, no, this is a security issue, or a former fire chief. So reaching into those parts of the community, and just trying to turn the dial, to shift the dial, to shift the conversation to their terrain that they're familiar with. And I think ultimately, when we see our politicians sort of, this, particularly again on the right of Australian politics, in my mind's eye, they're only reflecting their community. And so, but if you can reach in and make change in that community, then you'll see that, if the votes go, then they'll change their views.
It leads me to a question I wanted to ask you, Anika, because I'm a fellow farmer, and one thing that puzzles my husband and I all the time is no one up our way, we're near the Barrington Tops rainforest, it had major fires in it. Rainforests aren't meant to burn. It had 2 major fires. They are all convinced in the reality of climate change. The river dried up, it's never dried up, all that kind of thing. And yet when we ask them how they vote for climate change deniers. And we ask why, and the answer, that's who my father voted for.
Yeah, it's very tricky, and I agree, like all the farmers that I know and I talk with, you just have to look out the window and you're seeing climate change in action. I wake up in the morning and I'm seeing the dust fly past my bedroom window. There's very little denial, as far as I can see, actually in the farming community. And I think that's why we're really seeing, this growing voice coming out of rural Australia and from the farming community in particular, because we are noticing the impacts on our wallets today. We are looking at the impacts on the ground, and we're seeing people leaving our communities because the conditions are becoming so difficult. And it's unfortunate because we're missing all these opportunities too. Renewable energies on farms, they can give us secondary and stable sources of income. Carbon sequestration schemes and biodiversity schemes, as secondary and stable sources of income, ways to ride out these rough times like the drought. So it just makes so much sense that we start acting on climate change today. Yes, I don't know about why they're voting in that way. People vote for so many different reasons, but I think that's why it's so important for us as individuals to actually find our voices and to make sure that those who say are representing us are actually representing us.
Because I think that's the point I want to make, yeah. But Michael, you say the politicians represent their community, but certainly I think the divide between, let's say, the dominant philosophy of the National Party as it stands in Canberra at the moment and the rising alarm, I think, amongst farming communities, the disconnect is huge.
Yeah, that's true. I was talking to Michael Mann last night about the 60 Minutes when he was with Barnaby Joyce. And he made the point that there is incremental change, not as fast as we want, but I think the seeds of change on the Conservative side of politics are there, but obviously, clearly, not fast enough and not large enough. But he made the point that Barnaby Joyce didn't actually refute the science of climate change in that 60 Minutes, session there. So, this is a long way from, if you follow his statements, going back to 2010. So, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I'm just saying the seeds of that change seem to be, and it's going to be things like this, big events here in Australia, that will, when the community are impacted the way they are and the nation is impacted the way they are, blind Freddie can see it. So maybe that'll be the harbinger of political change.
And there's something else I've wondered about for a while, and I'd love your take on this. I think it's emblematic, or we see it clearly in the very odd reaction amongst a certain demographic towards Greta Thunberg. The absolute, almost, I can best act it out rather than use a word, that sort of, how dare she, stuff. And it strikes me that there's something else quite subtle going on amongst those who are in denial or resisting. And I'm sorry to be a battered old feminist about this, but it's like patriarchy has a view that nature is there for man's domination and that it is part of being the kind of winner bloke that you get to consume all the natural resources, that you get to mould, landscape, blast, frack, I offer, ladies and gentlemen, the natural world, and that by saying, no, we need to nurture, care for, collaborate and be guardians and stewards of this land, not its not its boss, that we are fundamentally causing an existential crisis among a certain kind of masculinity. Your take?
Yeah, Naomi Klein writes a lot about that, the extractivist mentality, and this changes everything. And it's great to see. Their worst nightmare, a young schoolgirl, just calling it like it is. So, but I think who cares anyway? Like, who cares about them? They're going to.
Well, they run countries.
Hey.
They run countries.
Not for long. Not for long, because they're so old, and with no disrespect intended. They're so few and they're so old. The actual, I always think there's three things in our favour. Basically, they're going to die. The solutions get cheaper, and the planet gets scarier. So those three trends are unstoppable.
Yeah, I think it's telling the good stories too. I mean, I look at the farming community, and farmers often have their eyes on the horizon because we need to make sure we've got enough vegetation to fatten the cattle. We need to be carrying enough water to water the crops next season. Many of our businesses are multi-generational. So yeah, you can't have that over-extractive mindset. You have to have that long-term vision, and they're the kind of stories and those messages that we need to be getting out there and going, this is what sustainability looks like and should look like.
And are you seeing farmers up your way changing their practices as a result of that and doing kind of more of the kinds of farming that you had on your slide before?
Yeah, farmers, these are incredibly adaptive, resilient breed of people, and that's why I love being in agriculture. In my region, in the far west of New South Wales, the rate and the scale of the changes, it's so great. We are really struggling to adapt because we are experiencing these extreme temperatures, weeks over 40 degrees. We haven't had proper rainfall for 4 years at least. What can you do? I mean, we've come to the end of the line in terms of adaptive capacity at the moment. We've got African sheep and goats, and we've had to destock. What's next? And this is why we need more research, development, extension, all of these things, and really looking at, okay, well, how do we help farmers adapt? How do we actually ensure food security for our nation?
Greg or Michael, do you want to comment on what we've been talking about?
I look back to Greta. I love Greta because my daughter rang me one day and said, "Dad, I just thought you're an old dickhead, but Greta's retweeted something you wrote." And I go, "Yes." And so just, if you didn't get that, I'm cool. But look, it's bullying. It's just bullying. They're like the bad kids on the school bus. Remember them? They'd sit up the back and they used to blow smoke into my afro, and I'd get in trouble. Mum said I was smoking, but
It might have been me.
They're just the arse. Yeah. No, you were good. The arseholes at school became politicians, some of them. And you've got people like in charge of America, a very stable genius. And it's just, yes, they will die, thank God. But, by natural causes, I hope, and with all due respect. But I do see the shift. So they've got to shout down. Bullies have to shout down anybody who says anything against what they want to happen. Forget the evidence. We don't rely on evidence. And I think it's shifting. The dialogue has changed. And I think it's actually a mistake. One of the things that appalls me about international politics and Australian politics is the politics of hate. They're the enemy, and we have to hate somebody. We have to blame somebody, the Greenies, who won't let us backburn. Wrong term, it's hazard reduction, you idiots. But anyway, the arsonists will tell the clouds to stop sending the arsonist lightning.
They're lighting floods now.
So we have to blame someone. We have to be angry, and it's just got to stop. We've got an existential threat, and people on the front line, like farmers, we're sitting here consuming, going, yeah, it's really bad for the poor farmers out there. No, this is fair dinkum. We're all affected by this, and we need our politicians to come together. And look, you've got people like Zoe Steggall trying to do that, trying to do bipartisan stuff. And people like me, I can't fall victim to starting to bag people in Canberra who won't listen.
It's okay, leave that to me.
Yeah, okay. But we've got to start bringing together and get rid of these bullies and just say, I wouldn't put up with bullying in the workplace, so you don't put up with it in politics either.
And can I... Just on bullying, I think it's absolutely true, and they bully other journalists as well. So a lot of these people in the media that have the big mouthpiece and want to be the loudest voice, and they also bully other media. They bully the ABC. And so we're into this false balance thing. We're stuck in it, and if you sound alarmed about climate change, you're an activist, and that applies whether to journalists as well. And and I've kind of got a view that if you tell the truth and the truth is alarming, are you an activist? No. So I think the media needs to push back on those people as well, and the media is at fault equally. As I said, the government should have done public education. Well, the media, by failing, by getting stuck on this false balance, is part of very big part of the problem.
We have a question from the floor. And it is, there is no voice for Indigenous people's experience. Now, I think that, to be fair, there were quite a few Indigenous people who speak long and loud about this. You may mean on this particular panel. How do we change this? I think maybe there is a voice for Indigenous people's experience. Maybe people aren't listening to it.
Just going to make a point there. There is a voice, and this is where I think, just bringing I mentioned the ADF budget of $36 billion. One thing with the Indigenous communities where I'm from and that we work with, one thing they're screaming out for is dollars, is money. They need that. They need budget to make things happen. They need to, develop that capacity to really get some good programs on the ground. In this instance, it might be caring for country. Again, pardon my military lingo, but caring for country units around each state or each city or each region, and bringing in those voices so they can actually, but giving them the kit, giving them the equipment, giving them the capacity and the capability to actually be part and do that. So I would say, this sort of, to me, lends itself to, we've got a lot of budget out there, we're a wealthy country, let's start allocating that so that we can see more voices in this space.
There was a guy called Bruce Shillingsworth that you might have seen on Q&A, just got stuck into the panel from the audience, goes, put the water back in the river. If you remember that episode on drought? First Nation right to water. He was talking at a climate emergency rally that was held, the People's Summit that was held outside the Parliament House last week. He's a great voice for how climate change is impacting Indigenous communities, and the truth is that they are disproportionately impacted. And so one of the people I've interviewed for this book, for example, is a guy, Simon Quilty, brother of the painter, who's a doctor out of Katherine, has moved, I think, to Alice now. But what you're talking about, and CSIRO has done work on this, is projections for that top end / interior that are uninhabitable. So you've got the world's oldest living civilization that's about to be, potentially, going to have to move. People walking off country because you can't, it's not fit for humans anymore. So, there's, I don't know if you read Sand Talk, the Tyson Yunkaporta book, but he talks about, okay, this is a catastrophe, this culture has faced catastrophes before, but there definitely are voices out there that are kind of talking about what is going to be the impact of climate change on Indigenous communities.
You remind me of the guy on Q&A a couple of weeks ago who said, when asked what can we do best about climate change, he said, get in the passenger seat and let us drive, as a representative of Indigenous Australians, and I thought it was brilliant. Any other quick comments before I move to the next question?
Look, just really quickly, a voice for Indigenous people. We've treated them abhorrently for centuries, and it's sort of a paternalistic, we'll listen now. The cultural burning practices, which I didn't know much about, but they're so sophisticated, understanding what germinates when when the birds are nesting, when they're... and you have to have that deep connection to country to understand it, and it can heal the landscape, but they haven't got any money. They can't do it. So these are the sort of things we need to listen to the people who looked after the place for 60,000 years before us or more, and partner and learn.
Thank you. Well, this looks like a question very much aimed at you, Anika. How can government help farmers that have reached limits to adaptation?
Well, the first thing that would help me sleep a lot better at night is to stop releasing more greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. We also need a national strategy on agriculture and climate change, a clear direction of where we're going and how we're going to get there. There are so many solutions held in agriculture, and how we can reduce emissions from our sector, and how we can draw down carbon from the atmosphere. And we need actually, the RD&E, we need the roadmap on how to do it, and bring in those fragmented efforts around the country which are doing great works, but actually make it more effective so we're not wasting the scarce resources.
And this one looks like it's for you, Michael. Does military climate preparedness go beyond disaster response?
That's a good question. I would say that yes, it does, but we have to remember the military is primarily focused on, I guess those, the so-called adversaries, always preparing for, this sort of low probability but high consequence event. So it is in the mix. It's increasingly in the mix, and so I think we live in a region, if we look at the Indo-Pacific, it's a mess with climate disasters. Disasters are increasing more than anything else. It's incredible what's happening. If you look to the Middle East, for example, certainly the instance in Syria where preceding the Syrian crisis and even the Arab Spring was triggered by, we call it our millennial drought. Well, they had a millennial drought they've been there for 2,000 years, and it was the worst in their 2,000-year history. And that was exacerbated by, Australia had, destroyed crops. Pakistan had destroyed crops. Russia stopped exports of wheat and so on, of wheat. So, and that then triggered this huge crisis, mass migration into Europe. So these are the sort of things that the military does prepare for. And yeah, certainly we're in a region, but it's also now here. It's home. It's on our home front as well. So,
I'm so glad you said that about the drought in Syria. I said that on the drum or something once and got castigated for days about it. So now I feel vindicated. Thank you very much. Greg, can you give some examples of fire management changes that are necessary?
Yeah, sure. Look, a few things that I've just got to do a bit of myth busting. So burning everything actually puts more carbon in the air and actually won't solve the problem. These fires, I've been to fires this summer that burnt over people's lawns, it burnt through areas that have been hazard reduced a year ago, and one fire up near Rattville where the leaves dropping from the burnt trees after the fire had gone through 2 weeks before burnt again. So, and satellite imagery shows that the fires actually sped up over light fuels. So these were weather-driven events, not fuel-driven events, but fuel reduction is part of the mix. We need to bring in that Indigenous knowledge, cultural burning, to try and heal the landscape as we burn and reduce hazards. Fire management, our fire services are excellent, the leadership is excellent, but they can't cope with this enemy. It's an overwhelming enemy, and don't, just look at California, firefighter heaven. I've worked there quite a bit. As many aircraft, fire trucks, people as you want. They lost 18,000 homes and 100 dead in 2018, 9,000 the year before. So globally it's getting worse. We need to look at building standards. Australian Standard 3959, we have to toughen up the homes so they don't burn and they can be refuges. We need community refuges like they're building in Portugal. There's just it's resilience measures while we're driving down the emissions, we must adapt to a far more dangerous here and now, not a future. It's here with us now. And we do need to use the military in support roles, not firefighting. Every logistics person in the fire service you release can jump on a truck, hopefully, and it's a force multiplier out there. And of course, aircraft, but our Prime Minister didn't know to stop it anyway.
You're among friends, Greg. We possibly have time for a quick answer to this final question. Stories from the front line don't affect politicians. Not sure that's true. What else can we do? Vote them out.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. There's politicians here that are certainly affected, and for example, Carol Sparks, the Mayor of Glen Innes, lost a home in the bushfires just now, lost 2 neighbours that she knew, and
Andrew Constance seems to be extremely affected.
Andrew Constance, the state MP. I just went one of the climate and health rallies I went to at Parliament House. Helen Haynes, member for Indi, takes in Kinglake, talks about the long-term effects of which she sees in her community. She's a public health expert. She talks about the long-term health effects of Black Saturday. Is still evident on the kids that have grown up without parents, what they're acting out, or they've got mental health problems of various kinds. I don't think that's true that the politicians don't care. I think there's too many of them trapped and being, there's only the number of skeptics in that Parliament, I reckon, is probably about a quarter at the most. But
that's huge, though.
Yeah, but it's still only 25%, and yet that, it's just that hard right rump that is through the Nats, controlling the whole thing.
Then again, there's the irony of Tony Abbott out there fighting fires. So, the irony of that.
There is just the irony of Tony Abbott. I think you could stop there. We've got 30 seconds left. Go, Anika.
I think there's a lot that we can do. Everyone can use their social influence, their consumer influence, their political influence. We know what's causing the problem. We've got the technology and the know-how to do it. It's just a matter of people getting their act together.
Greg, last word to you.
Ditto. But look, there's a lot of politicians, there's a lot of really good people, there's a rump who are bullies, and we've got to stop them bullying the majority who actually want to get on with it. And this is where we need this bipartisan approach.
Thank you so much. Can we please thank this awesome panel for all their expertise, their knowledge, their work, their effort, their truth-telling. And most of all, their refusal to give up.
Thank you, Jane.